We're going to shift from steel to water, and the oceans. From what you've heard, from the first couple hours of the conversation, the oceans and water have been referenced, but I'm not sure that everyone in the room probably fully embraces the power that our oceans have in helping solve for climate change. Why don't we start there with, you're, an oceanographer, a meteorologist, you're sort of now turning your attention to sort of investing, but talk a little about the power of the oceans as we think about sort of mitigating, sort of climate change.
Sure, thanks. I'm really happy to be in conversation with you about this really vital topic. We have a lot to be grateful for in the ways that the oceans have supported life and the sustainment of life on our planet. And this shows up in several different ways. One of them is through just sheer stabilization of our climate. So the heat transport that the oceans do in this corridor ribbon of currents that take the heat that arrives at the tropics and redistributes it to the polar regions where the waters are renewed and this deeper cascade of water into the deeper part of the ocean and this circulation that really redistributes the heat fundamentally. Another way the oceans provide us with life-sustaining properties is through carbon sequestration. So the bulk of the long-term carbon sequestration on our planet is achieved in the very deep part of the ocean. And it's in these key regions that I mentioned where those overturning circulations happen in the North Atlantic and the Southern Ocean. And that is, we consider those huge and really important carbon sinks. A third way is through oxygenating the planet. So back about halfway through the existence of the Earth, so 2.5 billion years ago, the phytoplankton, these microalgae in the ocean, were the original sources of oxygen on our planet and the great oxygenation event. And even now we rely on them as a vital source of oxygen. We also have terrestrial sources, of course. But the original oxygenators, these phytoplankton, do a tremendous service for us and also do their part as part of that carbon sequestration as well. It's really a beautiful system that has evolved on our planet.
So, obviously, Techonomy has tech in the name, climate a conference. We're talking a lot around new technologies, right? We just heard about carbon capture through technology. But when we think about sort of nature-based solutions, right? Land, earth-based solutions, do you think sort of a lot of times that plays second fiddle to all the amazing, as we think about, hey, technology could solve everything, we sort of forget about, the land-based, the trees, the oceans, and think about like, what does Propeller then as an investment firm, how does that play into some of these, nature-based solutions?
There's so much opportunity to invest in nature. And so, when we think about ocean carbon, we think about the coastal carbon arena. So that's in areas of preserving and restoring mangroves, seagrasses. So just take a track of mangroves in this coastal
mangroves,
region.
The
trees right at the fringe of the land and the ocean. They're just superstars in terms of carbon sequestration. So the equivalent of 5 times as much ability to draw down carbon as a typical tree stand of the same size. And so the ability to not just retain, but also to grow back mangroves, which have been decimated in many parts of the world. Also, I think about seagrasses as well. And so really one of the most gratifying signs was the declaration of 30 by 30, so 30% protection of land and ocean by 2030 that the majority of countries signed up to several years ago in the Global Biodiversity Framework, or COP15 in Montreal. It was a huge breakthrough. Already several countries have achieved those. well ahead of that time frame. So Colombia was the first, and now Panama to do that. And now there's equivalent moves to do this out in the open ocean. That's so-called biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, so that we're fully protecting larger swaths of the ocean as well. And so these are all incredibly important steps, and you can really see readily a role for technology and science in supporting those protected regions. So whether that's in being able to quantify the biodiversity through things like environmental DNA, like what type of creatures are in those areas, and how do we make sure that we're creating conditions to help them thrive. Things like acoustics, being able to listen for the sounds of life in the oceans and categorize what's actually there, so that we can show that there is growth and expansion of life in these places. And there'll be similar, beyond the biodiversity quantification side, similar benefits accrue around carbon sequestration when you have this revitalization of these places in the ocean.
So earlier we were talking about blue carbon. So blue carbon is the carbon captured by these mangroves and the ocean. Talk a little about sort of the people who don't, aren't using blue carbon as in their everyday conversation. What is it, and how do you think about it?
Yeah, so blue carbon is that coastal carbon, is the capacity of the ocean, the carbon on the fringes of the ocean that abuts the land, to draw down carbon. But there's also the open ocean part of this, and this is a large part of the sequestration is happening in the phytoplankton. So we call this intricate process as the biogeochemistry of the ocean. And when we have these phytoplankton blooms, these are microalgae that are then consumed by the small creatures, the zooplankton, that lie a little bit deeper in the water column in the so-called twilight zone. And it's this incredibly orchestrated dance where these zooplankton at night come up to feed when the phytoplankton go down a little bit deeper in the water column after they've been turning CO2 into oxygen. And so then that CO2 ends up being consumed, the zooplankton then consume the phytoplankton, and the detritus, we call that marine snow, is what ends up in the bottom of the ocean in this deeper sequestration that we value so much. And so some of the work that's being done now in the ocean climate solutions investing space, which our fund Propeller is a pioneer in, is in looking at ways that we can augment those natural processes. So how can we work with the ocean to draw down more CO2? And there's a range of different ways to approach this. And also the really important part of this is the monitoring, reporting, and verification. Like, how can we be confident that this process and this effect is being augmented or boosted?
So when you look at that side of your portfolio and the investments you're making, talk a little about the specific, companies, the technologies, the things that are exciting you the most about the opportunity of the startups that are helping sort of address some of these issues.
Yeah, so we talked about the nature-based. So we have one company in our portfolio that's looking at measuring biomass from space in the ocean. So quantifying seaweed. So seaweed farming is what's called macroalgae, is a really important sequester of CO2. And so some portion of those seaweed farms, the seaweed that's being produced, breaks off naturally, estimate is around 20 to 30%, and ends up in the bottom of the ocean and sequesters CO2 beyond what's actually extracted for the farming part of it. And so being able to quantify from space the biomass that's being produced, but also helps with the timing of the harvesting of the seaweed. And so the ability to look a little bit deeper through using AI algorithms below the surface level of the water column to infer the volume of biomass and the quality of biomass. And that has obvious extensions to broader types of carbon sequestration.
And the companies that are addressing that are addressing that from hardware, a software, sort of a data insights. Talk about what are the types of companies now that are emerging. Is that done by computer vision? We heard from, Hydrosat earlier, using microsatellites. But what are the breadth of types of solutions that are helping sort of measure these types of emissions?
Yeah, in the case of this company, they're able to, it's called Coastal Carbon, and they're able to utilize as a backbone satellite observations across multiple different channels of the spectrum. And they can combine that with in situ monitoring of the state of the seaweed. And they're training the models. These are AI algorithms, so they can tweak them, tune them, and be able to make evolved and improved forecasts over time across all these different parameters.
And we heard earlier about, again, this conundrum of AI, and its need for energy and its impact on sort of our carbon footprint and climate. How do you think about that as you look at companies that are leveraging AI and algorithms? They're creating carbon while they're trying to solve other issues. How do we start to think about sort of balancing out the amount of AI and how AI could become more sustainable in sort of, addressing these challenges?
Yeah, I think it's important to look at the relative contributions of these activities, and in the broader context of it's the large language models that are going to always be the largest sources of the power drawdown. And so when you think about sort of some of the activities around the margin in terms of prediction, whether it's the Earth system that's benefiting a lot from improvements in AI, or its quantification around this monitoring, reporting, and verification side of things, I think these application spaces will always benefit from improvements in efficiency that will come along with all of those activities associated with data centers and algorithm improvements that were mentioned earlier in the day. So I think we really will see the benefits accrue across the broader application space of these efficiency gains.
And where, we've talked a little about the impact of policy. Where does government come in, right? I mean, the oceans, we think about, is there a policy implication? How do policymakers, have to start to think about how we're, sort of, the impact on the oceans on climate change?
So there's, I'm going to pivot back to the climate solutions part in the oceans. It's an area we didn't really get into, but it's part of our portfolio, is ways of helping the ocean draw down more CO2 that work with kind of the natural effects. So one of the approaches is called ocean alkalinity enhancement. So it's counteracting the acidification of the ocean, making the ocean more alkaline so that it can draw down more CO2. So this is in the National Academy of Sciences report that came out a few years ago, one of the more promising approaches. But there's a lot of science and research that needs to be done on it to understand what are the effects of it, whether it's scalable, what would it look like, to be able to achieve this. And there's now a focus area within our government. The Office of Science and Technology Policy has a fast-track action committee focused on ocean carbon dioxide removal. And so this whole several weeks surrounding the time period we're in now, they've been having listening sessions every Tuesday where they talk about and learn from where the latest research stands in these topics. And they have a commitment on a very short period of time within this year to advance a regulatory framework for how to approach this solution space. And I think that's really important and really powerful that the government is taking a stance on it, because it provides much more guidance to the startups that are coming into this space, so they understand their ability to test and field capabilities. There's also an initiative, a nonprofit called Carbon to Sea, also in the space of ocean alkalinity enhancement, that is philanthropic support to focus on the science questions, to understand those dimensions that I mentioned earlier, and to do this in the context of several different test beds or field sites that are permitted and regulated, where the technologies can be tested on a very, very small scale, whether that's startups or academics who are coming together in partnership to look at the viability of these technologies and understand the potential, as well as a stage gating approach to it.
Right.
How do you know when this is advanceable?
So I think, we were originally introduced by one of your partners, Brian Halligan, who is the, co-founder of HubSpot. Obviously, he took his passion and sort of focused it on this area. You had a passion on sort of the oceans. Is there, when you think about the amount of capital that's accessible to startups on solving this, is Propeller unique in that the fund is focused on some of these solutions? Is there, in your eyes, enough capital and enough sort of investment that's looking at this space?
Well, so, Propeller is early stage capital, and one of the elements of Propeller that's really powerful is we established very early on a founding partnership with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is the most venerable, storied ocean research institution in the US. And since we've expanded our partnerships to other leading ocean science institutions, including Scripps. So we work closely with the scientists and helping them understand the viability of the research that they're doing and the science and technology to bring out and create innovative solutions to the world. And as early stage capital, it serves a purpose and a role in that space. And so that the early kind of de-risking of the science can happen in the context of the research. And then as these companies grow and attract more capital, we're seeing this from a lot of the more established funds that don't have core competencies or capabilities in the oceans or the climate solutions space. But want to commit resources to this and see this as a growth area. In fact, it's interesting, PitchBook did a report that came out a few weeks ago that within climate tech is a huge growth area. It's one of the reasons we're here today. Yeah. But the category of carbon tech is the most promising in terms of anticipated annualized returns. Yeah. And that is relative to all the other categories. That's relative to EVs, to sustainable foods and fuels and the built environment. And so the expectation is huge around carbon tech to deliver returns. And so that's also where we're seeing additional interest from investors in this.
So the follow-on capital, I guess the B growth rounds, are you starting to see that these funds are opening up and sort of open to looking at some of these types of solutions that you're, again, de-risking up front?
There's tremendous interest in this area. Yeah, it's been really gratifying to see. And, you mentioned Brian Halligan, our partner, and just really tremendous visionary to do what he did, to build HubSpot into the company that it was, and then to recognize really the central need and importance of climate solutions in this moment, and also what draws us together here today.
Yeah, and I think we're going to hear from a couple people throughout the day that had these radical shifts coming out of a traditional industry to focus, on climate, because they realized, sort of the problem that we had facing us. And yeah, Brian was fascinating when we first sat down with him. So for the people in the room, how should they think differently today, leaving the room and thinking about the oceans as part of our decarbonization strategy? What should they take away from this and potentially do differently or look at?
Well, so here's the thing. I waxed rhapsodic about what the oceans achieve for us. And there's also the flip side of that is some of you may be familiar with the planetary tipping points. So these are phase shifts happening in the Earth system that may be crossed or breached as we reach different warming thresholds. So those near-term potential shifts in the Earth system are all localized in our oceans. So past 1.5, it's degrees C, it's the potential loss of coral reefs. We already see this underway. We've lost 50% of them in the last 50 years. It's the loss of polar ice. And what that means for those circulation shifts that I mentioned earlier, the North Atlantic in particular, the AMOC, Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and the Southern Ocean. And so these sort of vital pieces of our system, those near-term potential shifts that would completely remake our planet, these are localized in our oceans. And so please bear that in mind, that the attention we give to the ocean benefits the whole planet and allows us to keep the stability of our climate that we take for granted.
Julie, well, thank you very much for educating us about blue carbon and the oceans and all the great work you guys are doing at Propeller. So thanks again.
Thank you.